Greetings, everyone, and welcome to our first Smart Irrigation Month webinar series, Bringing Water to Life webinar of 2014, and our first one focusing on turf and landscape issues. My name is John Farner. I'm the Government Affairs Director for the Irrigation Association. I'm pleased to be joined by Paul Lander from Colorado, who's going to be our expert speaker today. We had sent an email out yesterday advertising that Chad Forsey, our State Affairs Director, was going to be one of the presenters today. He unfortunately had a medical emergency in the family, so he is unable to join us for this webinar, but I'll try to step in and give a little bit of an introduction, overview on the topic about the Irrigation Association, and give it off to Paul, who will be presenting us on some of the specifics relating to green infrastructure, stormwater management, and irrigation. First, I want to talk a little bit about the Irrigation Association. For those of you who are not familiar with our association, our mission is to promote efficient irrigation. We represent both the agricultural irrigation industry as well as the turf landscape industry. Anywhere from the manufacturers, dealers, distributors, consultants, contractors, basically everything up and down the vertical line of the landscape, turf landscape irrigation industry we represent, and that's what we're focusing on today. We have 4 strategic initiatives of the Irrigation Association: education, certification, codes and standards, which are very important relating to this topic, as well as government and public affairs. This topic is really, really important when we are advocating on behalf of the industry on some of the new codes that are out there, standards that are being developed for the green industry, as well as government affairs, working with municipalities, cities, states, as well as federal agencies relating to stormwater management and water use through irrigation. Give you a quick overview of this webinar. First, we are recording this webinar, and in the next couple of days it will be up and available on our website, our Smart Irrigation Month YouTube page. So if you have any questions, want to listen to the webinar again, if you missed something, want to tell your colleagues that it's available, I will give you the web address you can visit at the end of this presentation so you can view and listen to a recording of this webinar. Also, we will be having a Q&A session at the end. We're expecting about 200 people on this webinar. We're already north of 150 people logged in. So if you have any questions, if you could please type them into the question box, I will go ahead and capture those questions and moderate a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. Judging by my presentation and Paul's presentation, we should have a fair amount of time for a good Q&A session at the end. So I'm looking forward to really driving a lot of discussion through our Q&A session at the end. But again, if you have any questions at any point during the webinar, please type them into the question box, and we'll get to as many as possible by the end of the webinar. So let's begin talking about green infrastructure. There are a lot of definitions about green infrastructure that are out there, and I've put 2 up there now that you can view. One is from the United States Environmental Protection Agency, and the other is from the U.S. Water Alliance. Both promote clean water. Both have an interest in keeping our water clean, whether it's drinking water, water for the environment, etc. We want to promote clean water through green infrastructure. And so you can see some of the different perspectives that we have here. From the green industry, which the irrigation industry is part of what we call the quote-unquote green industry's perspective, we value the plant material side of this thing. So how trees, shrubs, even turf grass promote clean water through green infrastructure, and how they can how the use of this green plant material can have a net positive effect not only on the overall environmental attributes of a city, but also the water that you are trying to mitigate the runoff into, whether it's a basin, groundwater, surface water, etc. So here's a graphic of the water cycle. This is something that when I go and I talk to legislators in my job, regulators, other policymakers, I like to throw out this water cycle graphic. It's what we've learned in elementary school. basically how water goes through the cycle. Water is neither gained nor lost. It just moves from one area to another throughout the globe. So you can see evapotranspiration, evaporation, oceans, snowmelt runoff, precipitation, how that all comes together for our water cycle. But sometimes this is a bit even too difficult for some folks, especially in the policy realm, to understand. So what I like to do is show them this graphic, which is a little bit of an easier graphic to view on the water cycle. Though it's very cartoonish, it really gives a good description on what we're talking about here. And my favorite part of this graphic is not really the sleepy drops of water and underground water storage, but it's the runoff side with the drops of water going down a slide, climbing to the top and going down and just going back into the ocean. And that's really what we're talking about here. You know, how that water gets from where it's at the top of the slide back down into the ocean, and how we can make sure that water is not polluting the ocean, so we can make that water available for the future through this water cycle. You see the evapotranspiration drops on top of the tree there, how that tree and this green area helps mitigate that stormwater runoff into the water. So why is the irrigation industry interested in this topic? Aren't we trying to mitigate runoff instead of use more water? So if you think of having an inefficient irrigation system, it irrigates whenever it over-irrigates. You already have some runoff into the waterways. So how do we mitigate this runoff? How do we use green infrastructure, but does irrigation even play a role? How can we use irrigation efficiently to make that plant material that is being used in the green infrastructure work better, instead of being a hindrance to the overall goal of promoting a clean water? You can see this graphic was taken from Philadelphia. You see the Philadelphia skyline in the background, and this is promoting their green infrastructure program. So you can see the use of trees, shrubs right there by the waterway. It's by the Schuylkill River right there, how they're using that green plant material to promote clean water. Also, we have to look at the U.S. Drought Monitor. This was taken this morning. This was valid at 7 o'clock in the morning Eastern Time, and it goes back to 2 days ago, January 28th. And you can see what we're seeing in California right now. And we're not here to talk about drought per se. We're going to talk about stormwater runoff and mitigating stormwater runoff through green infrastructure and role of irrigation. But you have to think of how drought affects green infrastructure. If a municipality is utilizing green plant material to promote green infrastructure, that plant material needs to be living. If it's not living, if it's not being maintained properly, if it's dead, that can have the same effect as concrete, with water just going right over top of what is now dirt, no longer soil, dead grass, dead shrubs, right into the waterways. So if we are in a drought time, you look at California right now, but 2 years from now, that drought may be in the southeast or even the mid-Atlantic states, where irrigation is not that prevalent, but green infrastructure is being used a lot in Chesapeake Bay watershed. How will that drought affect the green infrastructure that's being used right now? Will that plant material be able to sustain itself through a time if we were to have a rainfall period immediately after drought where the green infrastructure has not yet flourished? How will that mitigate that runoff? Can it be done? Also, on the irrigation industry side, we are dealing a lot with codes and regulations in dealing with stormwater. So the International Green Construction Code by the ICC, the IATMA Green Supplement to the Plumbing Code, the Environmental Protection Agency has stormwater regulations, and local municipalities, either through stormwater regulations or green infrastructure implementation. That is really important to what we're doing here. So in each of these instances, we have to view from the irrigation side, okay, how does irrigation play into this? What is our water source? Are we irrigating plant material efficiently and not over-irrigating to ensure that these discussions are done in a way where both green infrastructure thrives and irrigation is part of the solution, not part of the problem. And here we have some graphics of some of the plans that are out there. You see New York City has a green infrastructure plan. I mentioned Philadelphia, Nashville, and Davidson County all have green infrastructure plans. And these are becoming more of the norm instead of the exception out there throughout different municipalities. A lot are seeing the value of plant material, trees, shrubs, turf grass, efficient irrigation, rain barrels to use for your non-potable water needs in a residential or commercial setting. All this plays into green infrastructure. And again, the big question is, how does irrigation fit into all of this? And with that said, I'm going to introduce Paul Lander, as I take him off of his mute, as our presenter today. Paul is a consultant with Dakota Ridge Partners and also a lecturer at the University of Colorado. He brings about 30 years of experience in the fields of water, energy, and land conservation. And during, let's see here, he used to also lead the City of Boulder's Waste Conservation Office, directing the city's award-winning program for a community of over 100,000 people. He's also been very involved with the American Society of Landscape Architects, the Alliance for Water Efficiency, the AWWA Water Wiser Committee, and also very involved in the University of Colorado and other educational settings. So Paul, I'm going to go ahead and introduce you and go ahead and bring this webinar control over to you. So thank you very much.
Thank you, John. I hope you can all hear me okay and you followed John's discussion. He did a great job of kind of laying the foundation, setting the table, if you will, for the broader picture of green infrastructure. And I was sharing with John earlier, I really appreciate IA's willingness and interest in stepping up and being a part of the discussion of where do we go in the future with this very valuable resource, water, and our focus today specifically on looking at water quality and stormwater management. So in the first slide here, I'm not putting up anything. Go ahead.
Paul, real quick, I think I still see the, I don't see your slide yet. I'm not sure if others have seen your slide yet or not, but I'll make sure that you go ahead and share your screen with everyone before we get started.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. There we go.
Is that good?
Yep.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks for that, John. So this first image, I'm not taking anybody else to task. This was some excess watering being done on my watch when I was the City of Water Conservation specialist for the City of Boulder. And unfortunately, I wish this was uncommon. This was a really rare occurrence, and we know that this happens for a whole variety of reasons. But our focus today really is on a couple of things that John mentioned. And in the top kind of says here, one of the things we can think about in the Irrigation Association, can we be a resource for water quality managers who are under the gun for a whole bunch of things and are a much more highly regulated industry than irrigation historically has. So if there's things we can do to be helpful to them, as I'll say later, I think also we'll find that they may actually be able to help us with resources, because oftentimes, because of the regulatory nature, they have access to financial resources that we just don't when we're looking at irrigation only. So as John mentioned, there's a lot of cities that are concerned about their future water supply, the qualities of their water, this growing understanding of the interaction between impervious surface, which we see here, where water just doesn't penetrate, which is the bane of existence for stormwater quality folks. And in a lot of places, not everywhere, the impervious surfaces are kind of directly connected to the local waterway, and we'll see a little diagram about that later. In Boulder and a lot of newer western cities, we do have a separate system where any water that lands on a street does go to a storm drain, but goes to a local ditch or a waterway untreated. That has its own issues. Many of you are going to be located in the northwest, the northeast, where they have combined sewer, which has its own problems. If there's a significant rain event that's too big for the capacity of the wastewater plant, all of that flow, 100%, can go into the nearest water body untreated. So CSOs, combined sewer overflows, are a real issue for a lot of places, and we're seeing them take pretty significant and large-scale attacks at addressing that. And again, I think IA irrigation and water professionals can be a part of that discussion. This slide is just to kind of remind us again, there's this water use and water runoff does not go unnoticed. Nothing, I'm not telling you anything you don't know. A couple of images there. More and more bottom right, it's almost impossible to go into any modern city now that doesn't have every storm drain marked with some demarcation, be it a logo or kids have stenciled something on or something, reminding folks in an educational capacity of the connection between storm drains and either a creek or a river or potentially the combined sewer overflow issue, those kinds of things. So there's been a tremendous amount of activity in the last 10 or 15 years. We're trying to raise the general awareness of the citizens around us so we can hopefully think of them as allies. That being said, an awful lot of water still does go to local waterways. The little image on the left here, used in a lot of coastal cities, storm drains go straight to the ocean, right? That's a real concern for them, and some imagery of the impact it has on other species. The top left one is a poster put together by some folks around the city of Ventura, California, again, in educational capacity, helping people understand that they live in a watershed. That's still a new term for a lot of folks. In your educational efforts, you may have found that. Sometimes people think watershed is somehow an untouched, a pristine, a forested area, when the reality is, and you all know, any place it rains, we're in a watershed and that water's going to go somewhere. We're not helped in irrigation by having so much impervious surface for that water to come on. Doesn't mean we don't have a role in trying to keep the water on the plants, but it certainly exacerbates the problem. So I think that as we look at green infrastructure particulars, since John outlaid that, a lot of those plans that he illustrated for major cities, more and more the takeaway I would say is we're trying to bring more porosity, get more infiltration into our cities, and in irrigation that's going to be really critical for us to use that and understand that in a positive way. Well, what's the big deal about stormwater runoff? Unfortunately, there's a lot of bad stuff in runoff, and the landscape industry, in my view, can help with that by not having errant irrigation systems that add to that runoff. There's already enough from storm events. We want to be part of the solution if we can, and that's going to be a combination of new ways to design landscapes that infiltrate and hold water better and smart irrigation. So you can see a couple of just very simple sources here from the Lake Tahoe area, the upper left one, the major source of sediment, and the EPA in the last 5 years, a couple of different years, has said sediment is in fact the single most problematic pollutant for most urban areas because of construction and all the things we put on roads and those kinds of things. So sediment can be a real issue, and the source of that usually is urban areas. And so even particularly in dry areas like where I live in Colorado, we don't have to think about that since we don't have significant rain events on a regular basis like many other places of the country or the world. But the problem is everything is being deposited during dry weather. Sediment, drips from cars, brake linings, ash and dust, all those kinds of things. And the next time water is applied to an impervious surface, all that gets flushed in. And too often in dry areas, that water applied is actually coming from irrigation, not from a storm event. So we're under the radar to, by stormwater managers, to be able to step up and help them, and that is something we can do. On the bottom, a little bit more definition about some other kinds of things that happen to be pollutants of concern in urban runoff. As I tell my students, the 30 years ago, 40 years ago, we recognized in terms of pollution, it was mostly point source, tall smokestacks or big pipes that went into a waterway. We're now living in, for the rest of our professional careers, really the focus is non-point source, NPS, non-point source pollutants, which is all those little things around us, which in aggregate can have as big or a larger impact on our urban environments. And so that makes, but that also really, they're so diffuse, it makes it hard to kind of get your arms around that. Identifying a little bit what's in there is really helpful for us, and we can work with some of the other people who are directly, like construction materials, contractors, those kinds of things, looking at development areas, controlling sediment, those kinds of things. And in the landscape area, as John mentioned, a lot of these green infrastructure plans talk about the landscape serving even a greater filtering ability for water and all kinds of things in our urban environments. And I would maintain we're going to need smart irrigation to grow and maintain those plants so that they can actually perform that function and address some of the issues and the specific pollutants that we see on this slide. So, as you probably know, stormwater regulations can be serious. They take this issue quite seriously in a lot of places, all the way from, on the top right, San Diegans waste no water, the idea of everybody be efficient, water is very precious, there's a pollution issue, those kind of things. Top left, is there a hotline number if you see anything going on, posting those around town. So, again, the stormwater quality managers and water resource managers in a lot of areas have stepped up their game, if you will, providing opportunities and really encouraging the public to be a part of not only doing their own initiatives to reduce their impacts on the environment, but also reporting or engaging in educational opportunities that help everybody kind of play the game, if you will. On the bottom are just a couple of things I pulled off the web, very typical in a lot of areas, and maybe what you have as well, that we start seeing language in local ordinances, like in the middle of the screen there. Water used for irrigation purposes shall not be allowed to run off of a site. Well, that's an easy thing to do, and as you know, there's a lot of reasons that that could happen that may not have anything to do with the landscape designer, the landscape maintenance, a variety of things. But nonetheless, we're often going to be called in to be a part of the team to address that problem. The bottom two are from another area in California, defining to some degree what water waste is and how we might prevent it, and the kinds of things that you all know about different kinds of irrigation technologies that could help with that, but a penalty structure that goes along with that that may not be insubstantial. $250 on the first written notice and an additional $250 upon the second notice, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that it's not going to be uncommon where we see these kinds of things coming to play when people start getting serious about stormwater, and it is a serious issue. And so the whole idea of this slide is just recognizing the import that has to a lot of communities and our opportunity, I would say, as landscape professionals to step up and be a part of preventing these kind of things and not having going to that blunt instrument of regulations and fines, if you will, but getting smart and having incentives about doing the right thing, which is really what green infrastructure is directed at. Well, just a little background to, again, put some numbers on it, nothing that you all don't know, but it's becoming, we're getting better and better numbers all the time trying to calculate kind of the scope of this issue. And just for example, there was a great report done last year within Texas looking at an evaluation of urban landscape water use. Texas has had, as you all know, a couple of really tough years, and they're really struggling how they're going to meet existing demands, let alone addressing climate change, population, all those other things that we hear on a daily basis. So you can see on the pie chart there on the top, residential landscape is by far the largest area of urban landscape and lawn in Texas, but there are a variety of other ones that add to that. And in total, you know, almost 2 million acres, and that's a substantial amount of area. One of the issues we have is those particularly persistent issue in urban areas is those we know, those are cut into residential particularly, cut into a lot of those small pieces that aren't always very efficient to irrigate. And so the pictures on the bottom are all too common when we're stuck with leftover situations that as the landscape industry we're supposed to come in and kind of magically make look green. But it's a concern for a lot of people. These are large these are large amounts of area, acreages, and may involve a lot of water. In Texas, 14 to 30 inches of irrigation water per year. That can be double that in some of the hotter areas of Arizona or Nevada, those kinds of things. And for water providers particularly, who are often in the same water provider local utility with the stormwater folks, they're all trying to meeting together, and they're struggling with the fact that oftentimes it's more than 50% of the treated water in western cities goes to landscape. So there's compounding issues all the way along that we as landscape professionals could help with if we really kind of step up promoting and implementing and maintaining green infrastructure, and particularly smart irrigation. I don't have to read this to you, but the good news is there's data out there that shows, you know, we can and we do make a difference. Studies have confirmed what we know already. A well-maintained, designed system isn't going to do it by itself, but if all those factors come together, we can document that there can be substantial savings with things like smart irrigation controllers. The bottom graph there is from a study done in Irvine Ranch in the early 2000s, looking specifically with some EPA funding at the reduction in runoff, which you can see from the retrofit group. Number one, there had a 50% reduction in runoff post-intervention, whereas the control group that had no education or no smart controllers, no really assistance from the landscape industry, if you will, actually had an increase in their runoff. So these things that we do can make a difference, and we have to remember that, and sometimes this kind of documentation can help make the argument that not only it's a great idea, but we can document that we're doing the right thing, and therefore funds and resources should become available so we can continue to replicate this thing as we go forward. So cities need landscape. That's not just a biased approach, but I think almost anybody, a layperson on the street, would see that photo in the upper left and go, wow, you can see a little string of green there, but that's a pretty tough area, and as we know, has all kinds of environmental issues with it. And so more and more people want to move to the image or the reality of what's kind of proposed there in the bottom right. That's the Pittsburgh Center for Landscape, where they're trying to put in every possible green infrastructure tool and then kind of measure it and show people. And as many of you know, Philadelphia has actually endorsed that as the approach their public works department is going to take in the next couple of decades, looking at a green infrastructure-based approach rather than a traditional, what we would call gray infrastructure, pipes and pumps only. And certainly they're going to need to be used complementarily. But that is good news for those of us in the landscape industry. If nothing else, anybody could kind of guess, are you smarter than a fifth grader? Well, the fifth grader could tell you in the upper left, there's not much for a landscape professional to do. In the bottom right, there's a lot to do, and we better step up and be on our game. So we see more and more imagery like this, either through guidelines, suggestions, customer expectations, legislative expectations, or outright regulation. The top left from the International Green Roof folks, some of you may be aware, Toronto, many cities in Europe now require green roofs to some degree. Seattle has a green infrastructure requirement that doesn't limit it to just roofs or ground plane, traditionally horizontal, but you can actually make that up in walls as well. So I think we're going to see more and more of that. The other two imagery are more about rain gardens and infiltrating water on site, particular efforts that have been done by either bottom left Seattle or top right Portland, where they're trying to reduce that combined sewer overflow I mentioned, try to keep at least the rainwater and the irrigation water on site as much as we can, and not actually having an overload and dealing with the wastewater from sewage alone and trying to get the site-based water, if you will, keeping that out of the system. And in both of those cases, substantial incentives to do those kinds of things with the landscape industry. In Portland has quite, because they have a wastewater capacity issue, substantial rebates to try to keep water out of that system that goes to the wastewater plant, so it can help you pay for some of these green infrastructure items. Seattle has put a lot of money themselves into redoing whole neighborhoods, again with substantial financial resources and technical assistance, promoting the landscape industry, stepping up and doing the right thing. Bottom line for us, bottom line for the IA, all this green infrastructure is going to need smart irrigation for establishment, for maintain. Even places like Seattle, when I lived there in the 90s, I was surprised to realize that my myth was busted, realizing they don't have a lot of rain in the summer months either. So if they're going to have green infrastructure that's there and does the things that it needs to do and not dry up and be ineffective, as John alluded to, we're going to need smart irrigation. And that's an opportunity and a challenge for us in the landscape industry. Just another resource I want to make you aware of, if you're not, particularly when you have to go to the point you're trying to make a pitch or selling something, informing people, as John mentioned, decision makers sometimes have a hard time getting the idea. Well, there's a great tool out there that the Center for Neighborhood Technology in Chicago provided for all of us in trying to put this package together to help educate people about the way we need to go forward. So here's a very, very simple matrix that almost anybody can understand. Along the left side there you see the different kinds of practices, the different infrastructure, green infrastructure elements that we might use. Along the top there, the kinds of benefits we get from those, and then so the intersection, what's really helping about reducing flooding, reducing energy use, those kinds of things. And so that gives almost any decision maker, any group, an idea to be able to hone in what's appropriate for my area, for my community, what might have some possibility, is it worth further investigation. That's oftentimes where the diagnosis or frankly the educational information stop. One of the things I like about C&T's work is they went on to the next one, this next slide, where they said, we keep hearing back from practitioners, we get the idea that it makes sense on the gut level, but we need something a little more specific, some dollars and cents, if you will. So they went on further in this publication and started putting that together and did the very, very difficult work of trying to understand and catalog what those financial benefits are of these different elements. And I only say it's really difficult because it's very hard sometimes to get really good numbers on what some of the benefits are. But even with the work they've done, which they've documented as well, so you can see what their sources are, they come out with some fairly substantial things. So here's just one example of looking at something of a 5,000 square foot green roof on a large house or a small commercial building, and what those stormwater benefits are, the reducing energy use. The benefits again relate to the previous graph there, and then starting to put some numbers with that. So for one house, one 5,000 square foot roof here, you have a $450 benefit, and this is almost 5-year-old data. And so you start replicating that across large areas, large cities, those kind of things. That can really be helpful for you. I appreciate, again, the idea they've walked you through how they got those calculations, what their sources were, and hopefully as we get better information all the time, you'll be able to fine-tune that for your own community so you can get better information that really speaks to the areas in which you're working. So at the end of the day, like I started, I think the opportunities here is to be a resource for water quality managers and sustainability professionals in almost every city across the United States. They're going to have a whole suite of things that are on their plate. If there's an opportunity for us to be seen as resources for them, the profession's going to go a lot farther. We're going to get more resources coming our way to help with this green infrastructure move, if you will. Resources, not to give you just, again, some of the things to follow up on. Irrigation Association, obviously, take advantage of these seminars and webinars like this, provide a great basis for basic information getting going. The Alliance for Water Efficiency is a nonprofit that looks at just water efficiency specifically. A lot of good information, free information on their website, a great library of some of these studies that I mentioned, or follow up if you need some more technical or resource information to beef up your argument. The California Landscape Contractors Association, amongst others, they've endorsed the water budget approach, have a lot of technical resources about why landscape's important, how do we continue to make the positive talk about landscape is critical and it is really the backbone of green infrastructure. The Center for Watershed Protection, who's been working for 20 or 30 years, began to identify particularly this impervious surface, traditional way we develop cities is just really not good for our local water resources, which we all depend on. And so has done a great job documenting a lot of good biology and other things that put numbers to the many benefits of green infrastructure, of which smart irrigation and landscape professionals are going to be a part. The EPA has a number of sites related to these things as well. I'd encourage you to visit their sites and get some background. The Sustainable Sites Initiative, that's with the American Society of Landscape Architects, the University of Texas at Austin, some other places, increasingly is having more and more documentation of working productive landscapes, and I guess like performance landscapes, if you will. This green infrastructure, starting to get case studies that start putting real numbers there that give you ammunition in making that discussion, making that proposal, having a good pitch for doing that kind of work. My contact information is there on the bottom. I appreciate your time today, and I will turn it back to John.
Thanks, Paul. I appreciate that. And I received some emails from our headquarters office indicating that some of you may have had some problems seeing some of Paul's slides, and maybe some of the ones that the later ones that I did as well. I will say that if you did have any problem seeing the slides, I apologize for that, first of all. Second of all, if you're worried about CEU credits, don't worry about that. We have your name as attending this webinar, so if you're interested in getting CEUs but you had some problems with the slides not moving forward, don't worry about that at all. The good news is that I'm recording this webinar, and I was able to see all of Paul's slides on my machine via the internet, so I'm hoping that the recording captured everyone's slides, so that would be very helpful if that's the case, and we'll make sure to review the tape as it may be post-webinar to make sure that everything went by smoothly. If that didn't happen, I will get at least a copy of the PDF from Paul of his slides and put them up on our website as well. So, but hopefully the majority of you got to see those slides and Paul's presentation. It was very, very informative, and we greatly appreciate that. Now I'm going to go ahead and do our Q&A session. I apologize if my my screen is kind of going wacky here. So, Paul, there's been a few questions, and I encourage, if any of you have any other questions at all, please go ahead and type them into the question area of your GoToWebinar toolbar. But I'm just going to go ahead and read some of them that we received here, Paul. Let's see here. First of all, is there an acceptable amount of runoff that's out there, Paul? In your work with cities or your work in working for a city, was there an acceptable amount of runoff that was okay to have?
Well, that's a really good question and a very pointed one. And one of the slippery, I guess, issues about this, a lot of places say, through stormwater quality regulations, say the runoff from a site can't be more than it was pre-development. But that also kind of pretends that we had really good data pre-development, 100 years ago or before Philadelphia was there, right? And we can begin to calculate theoretically what that was if it was just a bare lot, those kind of things. So almost every jurisdiction will give you their technical definition, which is kind of what you have to live with. I would say, and with stormwater particularly, there's an attempt to keep as much as you can on site, always knowing with the retrofits, particularly in a lot of existing communities, there's going to be some leakage, if you will. That being said, I think, frankly, for our direct conversation today, there's less tolerance for irrigation with the idea that we could theoretically keep all of it on site. Again, we know there's reasons that may or may not be the case. So I think whether that's a stated part of your jurisdictional regulations or not, I'd say you certainly want to make every effort. And understanding that, and that's why I mentioned this connection here, if in the stormwater quality regulations there's a number that suggests how much is acceptable or it's almost nothing, that can be really informative for you working with clients to actually, again, put the resources are available to make your irrigation as efficient as possible. Without that regulation, people may feel like, well, I'll just go to the cheapest thing, and we know that's a problem. So again, sometimes these regulations, this direction towards green infrastructure can really help you firm up the argument of there's a reason to make the best of the best we have available within the irrigation and landscape industry.
Another question is also a good one in my opinion. Would it not be a better use for stormwater to enter storm drains that would then return water to detention ponds?
Well, that's a great question, and there's a lot of stuff in the engineering literature for sure, kind of working back of that train, if you will. We're always going to have, we had a huge flood event in Colorado, as many of you probably saw in your news. There's no question we're always going to need stormwater infrastructure for large, significant, atypical events. That's just not going to be able to do with that. What do we do with that slug of water? That's another issue. One of the things is that on the detention ponds, there's a fair amount in the literature that questions how effective they really are at actually a lot of filtration and mitigation activities. They typically don't, or oftentimes don't have the biological activity of actually infiltrating things on site, fully using soils and plants to their benefit. You actually get a much better water quality result, if you will, doing that kind of filtration rather than putting in a storm drain and then putting it into a detention pond. Again, back to the other part, those traditional infrastructures are also quite expensive. And the other thing that's increasingly an issue is every time you mass up and aggregate water together, you end up having a huge slug of energy that has to be dissipated in some way. Some detention ponds are made to have that, others are not. Detention ponds also, as you aggregate, that means the detention pond has to be bigger now if I'm not infiltrating on site and putting that to a common center. And as you can go around almost any metro area in the United States and see detention ponds that have been built through the years that I'm going to suggest, from my opinion, aren't necessarily a positive contribution to the urban landscape. They're often very poorly maintained with a chain link fence around them. There's a lot of dirt and debris, kids keep out, those kinds of things. So they have their own urban landscape asset baggage, if you will, in addition to some fairly well-documented cases out there, not typically as biologically effective as some of the other more distributed green infrastructure ideas we're seeing today.
The next question, I'll go ahead and take this one. The question is there any pressure on states to require irrigation be designed by a certified irrigation designer as water becomes more critical to conserve? It seems too many systems are being designed by entities who only have a superficial knowledge of well-designed irrigation. That's a great question, and one of the priorities of the Irrigation Association is promoting educated, knowledgeable professionals in the irrigation field. And when it comes to regulating industries on a state-by-state basis, it really needs to be tied to public safety. So the very, very short answer to this question is yes, in a nutshell. We are looking at ways to promote our certified irrigation designers, certified irrigation contractors, certified landscape irrigation auditors on a state-by-state basis to be the most knowledgeable and educated people to go out and perform those duties that are set through their certification. In some states, the irrigation design is already overseen by the Board of Landscape Architects, and we are having fruitful conversations in several states with those boards of State Board of Landscape Architects on ways to use certified irrigation designers in these larger projects. When tying it to public safety, really stormwater runoff, green infrastructure is there, because you are looking at ways to promote water quality and having a reliable water source for the municipality to have, a clean, reliable water source for the municipality to provide safe drinking water to its customers. So this is something, it is a priority of the Irrigation Association. We are working in several states, and if anyone has any specific questions on those specific states or our advocacy efforts, I encourage you to let me know personally through my email address that we'll share with you here pretty soon. Another question just popped up: is the IA going to promote underground stormwater storage via tanks more in the future? Water storage is another priority of the Irrigation Association, whether it's putting it in tanks, more retention ponds, more putting water back into the ground for groundwater storage. We are looking for ways to work with states, cities, municipalities, federal government to promote more water storage, really to mitigate the effects of drought, to have more water available, and through efficient irrigation, making sure that water that is available is not being wasted so it can be used for irrigation and other purposes. Let's see here. Paul, I think we have time for a few more questions here, and I think I saw one pop up. Let's see here. Maybe you know the answer to this question. What work, if any, is being done to evaluate the impact of stormwater runoff with hydrocarbons, heavy metals, and other toxic chemicals in the soils, plants, and groundwater?
I'm sorry, could you read that one more time, John? What's being done about it?
If any, and if you don't know, the IA can look this up too if we don't know it off the top of our heads. What work, if any, is being done to evaluate the impact of stormwater runoff with hydrocarbons, heavy metals, and other toxic chemicals in the soils, plants, and groundwater?
Well, there's a substantial amount of work being done. That third slide I had, kind of sources of urban runoff pollutants, that was actually from the early 1990s, and every one of the sources of pollution on there has been studied quite heavily by a lot of water quality folks and in the engineering community, environmental engineering community over the last 20 years. So there's a lot of literature, and I think, frankly, since our detection ability is getting better all the time, we're discovering more and more constituents in the water. So it's in the stormwater, that's part of the issue. And I think in an urban environment is what do we do with those large volumes that have all this stuff in it? And if it was, quote, as innocent as rainwater, that would be one thing. But unfortunately, with deposition of all kinds of things introduction of all kinds of materials in our urban environments, particularly these stormwaters end up being a fairly messy soup to deal with and are really difficult sometimes even in the combined sewer flow for some traditional wastewater plants to deal with who weren't designed to do that as well. So the constituents are there. There's a lot of science behind understanding what's in there. I'm certainly an IA and lots of the other professional publications will have articles about that. And that's why I went back to looking at what's the efficacy, how efficient are some of these different green infrastructure methods. The traditional detention or retention ponds sometimes are great for just dealing with volume, but they're not as great sometimes with dealing with quality. So that's why I think, frankly, the green infrastructure is starting to get more attention and being fully endorsed by a lot of folks in a traditional public works setting like Philadelphia.
Does irrigation runoff dilute the pollutants that will end up downstream in any case?
Does it dilute the pollutants?
That was the question. I think, let's see here. Yeah, I think the question really is focusing on, well, irrigation. Well, I think the question is focusing on if there is irrigation runoff, and if there is irrigation runoff, that will add pollutants downstream. And I think the key to this, with your presentation making this, Paul, is the effective, efficient irrigation and ensuring there is no additional runoff to ensure that green infrastructure is working properly.
Yeah, that's what most of the regulation and the science and the clean water plans, all those kind of sustainability plans you kind of showed before, directed at trying to minimize to as much as possible the contribution that irrigation runoff would make. We already have enough of storm stuff that we can't really do much that's coming from the sky, and let's not actually have irrigation contribute to that. And so my kind of counter argument to those folks as well is, well, that's great, but give us the necessary resources as landscape professionals so we can keep all that plant and soil material being biologically active, and we're going to need smart irrigation to do that. So there's a dual thing. We'll go ahead and do your thing, but minimize the runoff. We get that. But to really be effective for the other larger volume, if you will, that you're dealing with, we need to have really good living green infrastructure systems, and smart irrigation and landscape professionals are part of that.
Looking at soil health in bioretention facilities, if they receive contaminated stormwater runoff or irrigation runoff, what is the long-term health factors of that soil going to be?
Well, that's going to depend on the very specific constituents. So that's where, again, I would say the good news is for us, places like Philadelphia are deciding they're going to put billions of dollars into green infrastructure, which is good news for the landscape industry and smart irrigation. The challenge is we've got to start getting even smarter and understanding biological systems, because there's a lot of stuff in our urban areas, and the long-term efficacy of any infiltration area is only going to be as good as the original design and how well it's maintained, like the rest of the landscape. So our maintenance and understanding and continuation of sustainable landscape systems is going to be much more biologically based and less aesthetically based. They'll certainly go hand in hand to some degree, but at the end of the day, Philadelphia isn't just doing this on a whim. These green infrastructure systems have to work. That is their stormwater response now. So there's a great opportunity for us, but I think we're going to end up having to dust off, and I will probably be part of that, of continuing education in terms of, in addition to our smart irrigation education we're doing, remembering the soils and the soil systems and biology. That's the basis for all that plant stuff. We're going to have to up our game a little bit. But you also bring up a really good case that there's been a lot of, that's why I mentioned before, detention ponds. Early on, they were oftentimes designed solely just to handle volume, forgetting there is biological activity. And if you inundate a detention pond with a lot of constituents it wasn't designed to deal with, it's going to reduce the effectiveness of that. It just isn't going to handle it. You're going to have large sinks of pollutants, those kinds of things. So we're going to continue to have to work with people who understand those soil and biological systems hand in hand with this green infrastructure, so that those systems are viable for the long term.
And this question comes from my good friend Jeff Bruce. Stormwater facilities are large investments which most cities don't allow to be effectively used for irrigation harvesting. Any suggestions how we can circumvent these restrictions? And I can give some thought to that as well, Paul.
How we can utilize large stormwater facilities for irrigation?
Yes. Yes.
Well, I think, someone had said that before. I mean, one of the problems with, again, I think that's back to this larger discussion of, do you aggregate water together or you keep it disaggregated on site? And the aggregation has some economy of scale if you're looking at traditional infrastructure, but that's very, very expensive. And one of the concerns, I think, is what's the quality of the water going to be in there? And from the landscape perspective, we need to know what's the quality of water and how consistent is that water quality, because we have plant materials and, again, these biological systems that may have been designed with a water quality that isn't there anymore. And that's a whole other issue and topic we should address sometime, the changing nature of the source water we're given to work with as smart irrigation professionals. But I think more often than, so the idea of the cost of the infrastructure getting from that central collection place back out into a distributed network, like with landscape, is also can be problematic. So I'm guessing there's most of the resistance is really dollars and cents, not necessarily the volume, and that's going to vary. Some communities are going to be open to that. They do it in more of a wastewater, purple pipe kind of thing. Others are feeling like we're just going to keep it on site, or if they do aggregate it in some kind of a tank, it's going to have to be of a volume, and you're going to have some distributed use around metro areas and little pockets, but a complete network linking stormwater collection back to landscape availability, the economics probably aren't going to be there.
Very good. I'm going to go ahead and cut off our Q&A period. If you have any additional questions for either Paul or myself, our email addresses are showing on your screen right now. paul.dakotaridge@gmail.com. Mine is John Farner at irrigation.org. Wanted to go ahead and let you know about our future webinars that we have. We have once a month, my absent a few months here and there, September, August, November. But you can see the ones that are coming up. We have turf landscape ones coming up in March, July, and December on a wide variety of issues relating to irrigation. And if you have any questions about those upcoming webinars, would like to sign up for them, the web address is right there, irrigation.org/webinar_series. Be able to see the copy of this recording of this webinar on that site here in the next couple of days, as well as sign up for any of our future webinars as well. I'd like to take this time to thank Paul for his great presentation on green infrastructure and the role irrigation plays within green infrastructure. Thank all of you for attending as well. This webinar was over 200 people strong at some points throughout the webinar, so we really appreciate it. We hope to see you on future webinars that we'll give throughout this year. So thank you very much.
Thanks, John.
Thank you.